Foxfire. Once upon a time, there was a strong young farmer who came home late one evening from market. His way led him past the gardens of a wealthy gentleman, in which stood a number of tall buildings. Suddenly he saw something shining floating in the air inside the gardens, something which glowed like a ball of crystal. He was astonished and climbed the wall around the gardens, but there was not a human being in sight. All he saw was, at a distance, something which appeared to be a dog, looking up at the moon. And whenever it blew its breath out, a ball of fire came out of its mouth and rose to the moon. And whenever it drew its breath in, the ball sank down again, and it caught it in its jaws. And so it went on without a stop. Then the farmer realized that it was a fox who was preparing the elixir of life. He hid in the grass and waited until the ball of fire came down again, at about the height of his own head. Then he stepped hastily from his hiding place, took it away, and at once swallowed it, and he could feel it glow as it passed down his throat into his stomach. When the fox saw what had happened, he grew angry. He looked furiously at the farmer, but feared his strength. For this reason he did not dare attack him, but went angrily on his way. From that time on, the farmer boy could make himself invisible, was able to see ghosts and devils, and had intercourse with the spirit world. In cases of sickness, when people lay unconscious, he could call back their souls, and if someone had committed a sin, he could plead for them. He earned much money owing to these gifts. When he reached his 50th year, he withdrew from all things and would no longer exercise his arts. One summer evening, he was sitting in his courtyard, enjoying the cool air. While there he drank a number of goblets of wine, and by midnight had fallen fast asleep. Suddenly he awoke, feeling ill. It seemed as though someone were patting him on the back, and before he knew it, the ball of fire had leaped out from his throat. At once a hand reached for it, and a voice said, "For 30 long years you kept my treasure from me, and from a poor farmer lad you have grown to be a wealthy man. Now you have enough, and I would like to have my fireball back again." Then the man knew what had happened, but the fox was gone. Note: the thought underlying the story is the belief that the fox prepares the elixir of life out of his own breath, which he allows to rise to the moon. If a thief can rob him of the elixir, he gains supernatural powers. Noist stories. The talking silver foxes. The silver foxes resemble other foxes, but are yellow, fire red, or white in color. They know how to influence human beings, too. There is a kind of silver fox which can learn to speak like a man in a year's time. These foxes are called talking foxes. Southwest of the Bay of Kyushu, there is a mountain by the edge of the sea, shaped like a tower, and hence known as Tower Mountain. On the mountain there is an old temple with the image of a goddess who is known as the Old Mother of Tower Mountain. When children fall ill in the surrounding villages, the magicians often give orders that paper figures of them be burned at her altar, or little lime images of them be placed around it. And for this reason, the altar and its surroundings are covered with hundreds of figures of children made in lime. Paper flowers, shoes, and clothing are also brought to the Old Mother, and lie in a confusion of colors. The pilgrimage festivals take place on the 3rd day of the 3rd month and the 9th day of the 9th month. And then there are theatrical performances, and the holy writings are read. And there is also an annual fair. The girls and women of the neighborhood burn incense and pray to the goddess. Parents who have no children go there and pick out one of the little children made of lime, and tie a red thread around its neck, or even secretly break off a small bit of its body, dissolve it in water, and drink it. Then they pray quietly that a child may be sent them. Behind the temple is a great cave where, in former times, some talking foxes used to live. They would even come out and seat themselves on the point of a steep rock by the wayside. When a wanderer came by, they would begin to talk to him in this fashion. "Wait a bit, neighbor. First smoke a pipe." The traveler would look around in astonishment to see where the voice came from, and would become very much frightened. If he did not happen to be exceptionally brave, he would begin to perspire with terror and run away. Then the fox would laugh, "Hi, hi!" Once a farmer was ploughing on the side of the mountain. When he looked up, he saw a man with a straw hat, wearing a mantle of woven grass and carrying a pick across his shoulder, coming along the way. "Neighbor Wang," said he, "first smoke a pipeful and take a little rest. Then I will help you plough." Then he called out, "Hoo!" the way farmers do when they talk to their cattle. The farmer looked at him more closely and saw then that he was a talking fox. He waited for a favorable opportunity, and when it came, gave him a lusty blow with his ox whip. He struck home, for the fox screamed, leaped into the air, and ran away. His straw hat, his mantle of woven grass, and the rest he left lying on the ground. Then the farmer saw that the straw hat was just woven out of potato leaves. He had cut it in two with his whip. The mantle was made of oak leaves, tied together with little blades of grass. And the pick was only the stem of a cowling plant, to which a bit of brick had been fastened. Not long after, a woman in a neighboring village became possessed. A picture of the head priest of the Taoists was hung up in her room, but the evil spirit did not depart. Since there were none who could exorcise devils in the neighborhood, and the trouble she gave was unendurable, the woman's relatives decided to send to the temple of the god of war and beg for aid. But when the fox heard of it, he said, "I am not afraid of your Taoist high priest, nor of your god of war. The only person I fear is your neighbor Wang in the eastern village, who once struck me cruelly with his whip." This suited the people to a T. They sent to the eastern village and found out who Wang was. And Wang took his ox whip and entered the house of the possessed woman. Then he said in a deep voice, "Where are you? Where are you? I have been on your trail for a long time. And now, at last, I have caught you." With that he snapped his whip. The fox hissed and spat and flew out of the window. They had been telling stories about the talking fox of Tower Mountain for more than 100 years, when one fine day a skillful archer came to that part of the country who saw a creature like a fox, with a fiery red pelt, whose back was striped with grey. It was lying under a tree. The archer aimed and shot off its hind foot. At once it said in a human voice, "I brought myself into this danger because of my love for sleep, but none may escape their fate. If you capture me, you will get at the most no more than 5,000 pieces of copper for my pelt. Why not let me go instead? I will reward you richly, so that all your poverty will come to an end." But the archer would not listen to him. He killed him, skinned him, and sold his pelt, and sure enough, he received 5,000 pieces of copper for it. From that time on, the fox spirit ceased to show itself. Note: the silver fox is known in Chinese as pai. The same word also being used for panthers, since this legendary beast partakes of the nature of both animals. The Old Mother is really the mother goddess of the Taishan, but in other localities she is chiefly honored as a child-giving goddess. A picture of the head priest of the Taoists, talismans painted by the head priest of the Taoists or the Taoist Pope, the so-called Master of the Heavens, Tian Shi, have special virtues against all kinds of sorcery and enchantment. The war god Guandi also is appealed to as a savior in all sorts of emergencies. The Constable. In a city in the neighborhood of Kaiucho, there once lived a constable by the name of Dong. One day, when he returned from a hunt after thieves, the twilight had already begun to fall. So, before he waded through the stream that flowed through the city, he sat down on the bank, lit a pipe, and took off his shoes. When he looked up, he suddenly saw a man in a red hat, dressed as a constable, crouching beside him. Astonished, he inquired, "Who are you? Your clothes indicate that you are a member of our profession, but I have never yet seen you among the men of our local force. Tell me, pray, whence you come?" The other answered, "I am weary, having come a long journey, and would like to enjoy a pipeful of tobacco in your company. I am sure you will not object to that." Dung handed him a pipe and tobacco, but the other constable said, "I do not need them. Just you keep on smoking. It is enough for me to enjoy the odor." So they chatted a while together, and together waded through the stream. And gradually they became quite confidential, and the stranger said, "I will be quite frank with you. I am the head constable of the netherworld, and am subject to the lord of the great mountain. You yourself are a constable of reputation here in the upper world, and, because of my skill, I have standing in the world below. Since we are so well suited to each other, I should like to enter into a bond of brotherhood with you." Dung was agreeable and asked, "But what really brings you here?" Said the other. "In your district there lives a certain Wang, who was formerly superintendent of the granaries, and at that time caused the death of an officer. This man has now accused him in the netherworld. The king of the netherworld cannot come to a decision in the case, and therefore has asked the lord of the great mountain to settle it. The lord of the great mountain has ordered that Wang's property and life be shortened. First, his property is to be sequestered here in the upper world, and then his soul is to be dragged to the nether one. I have been sent out by the judge of the dead to fetch him. Yet the established custom is, when someone is sent for, that the constable has first to report to the god of the city. The god of the city then issues a summons, and sends one of his own spirit constables to seize the soul and deliver it over to me. Only then may I take it away with me." Dung asked him further particulars, but the other merely said, "Later on you will see it all for yourself." When they reached the city, Dung invited his colleague to stay at his home, and entertained him with wine and food. But the other only talked and touched neither the goblet nor the chopsticks. Said Dung, "In my haste I could not find any better meal for you. I am afraid it is not good enough." But his guest replied, "Oh no, I am already surfeited and satisfied. We spirits feed only on odors, in which respect we differ from men." It was late at night before he set out to visit the temple of the city god. No sooner did morning dawn than he reappeared to take farewell and said, "Now all is in order. I am off. In 2 years' time you will go to Taiyanfu, the city near the great mountain, and there we will meet again." Dung began to feel ill at ease. A few days later, in fact, came the news that Wang had died. The district mandarin journeyed to the dead man's natal village in order to express his sympathy. Among his followers was Dung. The innkeeper there was a tenant of Wang's. Dung asked him, "Did anything out of the ordinary happen when Sir Wang died?" "It was all very strange," answered the innkeeper, "and my mother, who had been very busy in his house, came home and fell into a violent fever. She was unconscious for a day and a night, and could hardly breathe. She came to on the very day when the news of Sir Wang's death was made public, and said, I have been to the netherworld, and I met him there. He had chains about his neck, and several devils were dragging him along. I asked him what he had done, but he said, I have no time to tell you now. When you return, ask my wife, and she will tell you all. And yesterday my mother went there and asked her. And Wang's wife told her with tears, My master was an official, but for a long time he did not make any headway. He was superintendent of the granaries in Nanking, and in the same city was a high officer, with whom my master became very intimate. He always came to visit at our house, and he and my master would talk and drink together. One day my master said to him, We administrative mandarins have a large salary and a good income besides. You are an officer and have even reached the second step in rank, yet your salary is so small that you cannot possibly make it do. Have you any other income aside from it? The officer replied, We are such good friends that I know I can speak openly to you. We officers are compelled to find some additional sources of revenue in order that our pockets may not be altogether empty. When we pay our men, we make a small percentage of gains on the exchange, and we also carry more soldiers on our rosters than there actually are present. If we had to live on our salaries, we would die of hunger. When my husband heard him say this, he could not rid himself of the idea that by disclosing these criminal proceedings, the state would be indebted to him, and that it would surely aid his plans for advancement. On the other hand, he reflected that it would not be right to abuse his friend's confidence. With these ideas in his mind, he retired to his inner rooms. In the courtyard stood a round pavilion. Lost in heavy thought, he crossed his hands behind his back, and for a long time walked round and round the pavilion. Finally he said with a sigh, Charity begins at home. I will sacrifice my friend. Then he drew up his report, in which the officer was indicted. An imperial order was issued, the matter was investigated, and the officer was condemned to death. My husband, however, was at once increased in rank, and from that time on advanced rapidly. And with the exception of myself, no one ever knew anything of the matter. When my mother told them of her encounter with Wang in the netherworld, the whole family burst into loud weeping. 4 tents full of Buddhist and Taoist priests were sent for, who fasted and read masses for 35 days in order that Wang might be delivered. Whole mountains of paper money, silk and straw figures were burned, and the ceremonies have not as yet come to an end. When Dung heard this, he was very much frightened. 2 years later, he received an order to journey to Tianfu, in order to arrest some robbers there. He thought to himself, My friend, the spirit, must be very powerful indeed. To have known about this trip so far in advance, I must inquire for him. Perhaps I will see him again. When he reached Tianfu, he sought out an inn. The innkeeper received him with the words, Are you Master Dung, and have you come from the Bay of Kaiucho? I am the man, answered Dung, alarmed. How do you happen to know me? The innkeeper replied, The constable of the temple of the Great Mountain appeared to me last night and said, Tomorrow a man by the name of Dung, who is a good friend of mine, is coming from the Bay of Kaiucho. And then he described your appearance and your clothes to me exactly, and told me to make careful note of them. And when you came to treat you with the greatest consideration, and to take no pay from you, since he would repay me lavishly. So when I saw you coming, everything was exactly as my dreams had foretold, and I knew you at once. I have already prepared a quiet room for you, and beg that you will condescend to make yourself at ease. Joyfully Dung followed him, and the innkeeper waited on him with the greatest consideration, and saw that he had great plenty to eat and to drink. At midnight the spirit arrived. Without having opened the door, he stood by Dung's bedside, gave him his hand, and asked how things had gone with him since he had last seen him. Dung answered all his questions, and thanked him into the bargain for appearing to the innkeeper in a dream. He continued to live for some days at the inn. During the day he went walking on the great mountain, and at night his friend came to visit him and talked with him, and at the same time asked him what had happened to Sir Wang. "His sentence has already been spoken," answered the other. This man pretended to be conscientious and traitorously brought about the death of his friend. Of all sins there is no greater sin than this. As a punishment, he will be sent forth again into the world as an animal. Then he added, "When you reach home, you must take constant care of your health. Fate has allowed you 78 years of mortal life. When your time is up, I will come to fetch you myself. Then I will see that you obtain a place as constable in the netherworld, where we can always be together." When he had said this, he disappeared. Note: the constable is a tale of modern origin. The lord of the great mountain, Taishan, is even greater than Yan Wang, the god of death. His temple of the easterly holy mountain, Dongyo Miao, is to be found in every district capital. These temples play an important part in the care of the dead before interment. Once upon a time, a man named Hu Wu Bao, who lived near the great mountain, went walking there one day, and there, under a tree, he met a messenger in a red robe who called out to him, "The lord of the great mountain would like to see you." The man was much frightened, but dared offer no objection. The messenger bade him shut his eyes, and when he was allowed to open them again after a short time, he found himself standing before a lofty palace. He entered it to see the god. The latter had a meal prepared for him and said, "I only sent for you today because I had heard you intended traveling to the west, and in that case I should like to give you a letter to take to my daughter." "But where is your daughter?" asked the man. "She is married to the river god," was the reply. "All you need to do is to take along the letter lying there. When you reach the middle of the Yellow River, beat against the side of the ship and call out, 'Greencoat!' Then someone will appear and take the letter from you." And with these words he handed Hu Wu Bao the letter, and he was taken back again to the upper world. When he came to the Yellow River on his journey, he did what the lord of the great mountain had told him, and cried, "Greencoat!" And sure enough, a girl in green garments rose from the water, took him by the hand, and told him to close his eyes. Then she led him into the palace of the river god, and he delivered the letter. The river god entertained him splendidly, and thanked him as best he knew how. At parting he said, "I am grateful that you have made this long journey to see me. I have nothing to give you, however, save this pair of green silk shoes. While you are wearing them, you can keep on walking as long as you like and never grow weary. And they will give you the second sight, so that you will be able to see the spirits and gods." The man thanked him for the gift and returned to his ship. He continued on his journey to the west, and after a year had passed, came back again. When he reached the great mountain, he thought it would be fit and proper to report to the god. So he once more knocked against the tree and gave his name. In a moment, the red-clad messenger appeared and led him to the lord of the mountain. So he reported that he had delivered the letter to the river god, and how all things were there, and the lord of the mountain thanked him. During the meal which the god had prepared for him, he withdrew for a few moments to a quiet spot. Suddenly, he saw his deceased father bound and loaded with chains, who, together with several hundred other criminals, was doing menial labor. Moved to tears, he asked, "Oh, my father, why are you here?" His father replied, "During my life on earth, I happened to tread on bread. Hence, I was condemned to hard labor at this spot. I have passed 2 years in this manner, yet their bitterness has been unspeakable. Since you are acquainted with the Lord of the Mountain, you might plead for me, and beg him to excuse me from this task, and make me the field god in our village." His son promised to do so, and went back and pleaded with the Lord of the Mountain as he had agreed. The latter seemed inclined to listen to his prayer, yet said warningly, "The quick and the dead tread different paths. It is not well for the dead and the living to abide near one another permanently." The man returned home. Yet, in about a year's time, nearly all his children had died. In the terror of his heart, he turned to the Lord of the great mountain. He beat on the tree. The red coat came and led him into the palace. There he told of his misfortune and begged the god to protect him. The Lord of the Mountain smiled. "Did I not tell you in the start that the quick and the dead tread different paths, and that it is not well if they abide near each other permanently? Now you see what has happened." Yet he sent his messenger to fetch the man's father. The father came, and the god spake to him as follows, "I forgave you your offense and sent you back to your home as a field god. It was your duty to bring happiness to your family. Instead, nearly all of your grandchildren have died off. Why is this?" And the father said, "I had been away from home so long that I was overjoyed to return. Besides, I had meat and drink in overflowing measure. So I thought of my little grandchildren and called them to me. Then the Lord of the great mountain appointed another field god for that village, and also gave the father another place. And from that time no further misfortune happened to the family of Hu Wu Bao." Note: the Lord of the great mountain was originally Huang Fei Hu, a faithful servant of the tyrant Shu Xin. Because of an insult offered him, he joined King Wu, and when the latter overcame the tyrant, was made Lord of the Mountain and Overlord of the 10 princes of the Netherworld. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Ma, whose father taught him himself, at home. The window of the upper story looked out on the rear upon a terrace belonging to old Wang, who had a garden of chrysanthemums there. One day, Ma rose early and stood leaning against the window, watching the day dawn. And out came old Wang from his terrace and watered his chrysanthemums. When he had just finished and was going in again, along came a water carrier bearing 2 pails on his shoulders, who seemed to want to help him. But the old man grew annoyed and motioned him off. Yet the water carrier insisted on mounting the terrace, so they pulled each other about on the terrace edge. It had been raining. The terrace was slippery, its border high and narrow, and when the old man thrust back the water carrier with his hand, the latter lost his balance, slipped and tumbled down the slope. Then the old man hastened down to pick him up, but the 2 pails had fallen on his chest, and he lay there with feet outstretched. The old man was extremely frightened. Without uttering a sound, he took hold of the water carrier's feet and dragged him through the back door to the bank of the stream which flowed by the garden. Then he fetched the pails and set them down beside the corpse. After that he went home, locked the door, and went to bed again. Little Ma, in spite of his youth, thought it would be better to say nothing about an affair of this kind in which a human life was involved. He shut the window and withdrew. The sun rose higher, and soon he heard a clamour without. "A dead man is lying on the river bank." The constable gave notice. And in the afternoon, the judge came up to the beating of gongs, and the inspector of the dead knelt down and uncovered the corpse. Yet the body showed no wound. So it was said, he slipped and fell to his death. The judge questioned the neighbors, but the neighbors all insisted that they knew nothing of the matter. Thereupon the judge had the body placed in a coffin, sealed it with his seal, and ordered that the relatives of the deceased be found. And then he went his way. 9 years passed by, and young Ma had reached the age of 21 and become a baccalaureate. His father had died, and the family was poor. So it came about that in the same room in which he had formerly studied his lessons, he now gathered a few pupils about him to instruct them. The time for examinations drew near. Ma had risen early in order to work. He opened the window, and there, in the distant alley, he saw a man with 2 pails gradually drawing nearer. When he looked more closely, it was the water carrier. Greatly frightened, he thought that he had returned to repay old Wang. Yet he passed the old man's door without entering it. Then he went a few steps further to the house of the Lis, and there went in. The Lis were wealthy people, and since they were near neighbors, the Mas and they were on a visiting footing. The matter seemed very questionable to Ma, and he got up and followed the water carrier. At the door of Li's house, he met an old servant who was just coming out and who said, "Heaven is about to send a child to our mistress. I must go buy incense to burn to the gods in order to show our gratitude." Ma asked, "Did not a man with 2 pails of water on his shoulder just go in?" The servant said they had not, but before he had finished speaking, a maid came from the house and said, "You need not go to buy incense, for I have found some. And, through the favor of heaven, the child has already come to us." Then Ma began to realize that the water carrier had returned to be born again into the life of earth, and not to exact retribution. He wondered, though, for what merit of his the former water carrier happened to be reborn into so wealthy a family. So he kept the matter in mind, and from time to time inquired as to the child's well-being. 7 more years went by, and the boy gradually grew up. He did not show much taste for learning, but he loved to keep birds. Old Wang was still strong and healthy, and though he was by this time more than 80 years old, his love for his chrysanthemums had only increased with age. One day Ma once more rose early and stood leaning against his window, and he saw old Wang come out upon his terrace and begin to water his chrysanthemums. Little Li sat in the upper story of his house flying his pigeons. Suddenly, some of the pigeons flew down on the railing of the flower garden. The boy was afraid they might fly off and called them, but the pigeons did not move. The boy did not know what to do. He picked up stones and threw them at the birds. By mistake, one of them struck old Wang. The old man started, slipped, and fell down over the terrace. Time passed, and he did not rise. He lay there with his feet outstretched. The boy was very much frightened. Without uttering a sound, he softly closed his window and went away. The sun gradually rose higher, and the old man's sons and grandsons all came out to look for him. They found him and said, "He slipped and fell to his death," and they buried him as was the custom. Note: this little tale from the Sin Si Hya is a literary masterpiece because of the exactness with which the punishment follows upon the act long after the latter has been forgiven, and all chance of mishap seem to have passed. The ghost who was foiled. There are ghosts of many kinds, but the ghosts of those who have hung themselves are the worst. Such ghosts are always coaxing other living people to hang themselves from the beams of the roof. If they succeed in persuading someone to hang himself, then the road to the netherworld is open to them. and they can once more enter into the wheel of transformation. The following story of such a ghost is told by persons worthy of belief. Once upon a time, there lived a man in Shofu who had passed his military examination and had been ordered to Chinanfu to report for duty. It was at the season of rains, so it happened that evening came on before he could reach the town inn where he had expected to pass the night. Just as the sun was setting, he reached a small village and asked for a night's lodging. But there were only poor families in the village who had no room for him in their huts. So they directed him to an old temple which stood outside the village, and said he could spend the night there. The images of the gods in the temple were all decayed, so that one could not distinguish one from the other. Thick spider webs covered the entrance, and the dust lay inches high everywhere. So the soldier went out into the open, where he found an old flight of steps. He spread out his knapsack on a stone step, tied his horse to an old tree, took his flask from his pocket, and drank, for it had been a hot day. There had been a heavy rain, but it had just cleared again. The new moon was on the decline. The soldier closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound in the temple, and a cool wind passed over his face and made him shudder. And he saw a woman come out of the temple, dressed in an old, dirty red gown and with a face as white as a chalk wall. She stole past quietly, as though she were afraid of being seen. The soldier knew no fear. So he pretended to be asleep and did not move, but watched her with half-shut eyes, and he saw her draw a rope from her sleeve and disappear. Then he knew that she was the ghost of one who had hung herself. He got up softly and followed her, and, sure enough, she went into the village. When she came to a certain house, she slipped into the court through a crack in the door. The soldier leaped over the wall after her. It was a house with 3 rooms. In the rear room, a lamp was burning dimly. The soldier looked through the window into the room, and there was a young woman of about 20 sitting on the bed, sighing deeply, and her kerchief was wet through with tears. Beside her lay a little child, asleep. The woman looked up toward the beam of the ceiling. One moment she would weep, and the next she would stroke the child. When the soldier looked more closely, there was the ghost sitting up on the beam. She had passed the rope around her neck and was hanging herself in dumb show. And whenever she beckoned with her hand, the woman looked up toward her. This went on for some time. Finally the woman said, "You say it would be best for me to die." "Very well then, I will die, but I cannot part from my child." And once more she burst into tears. But the ghost merely laughed and coaxed her again. So the woman said determinedly, "It is enough. I will die." With these words, she opened her chest of clothes, put on new garments, and painted her face before the mirror. Then she drew up a bench and climbed up on it. She undid her girdle and knotted it to the beam. She had already stretched forth her neck and was about to leap from the bench, when the child suddenly awoke and began to cry. The woman climbed down again and soothed and quieted her child, and while she was petting it, she wept, so that the tears fell from her eyes like a string of pearls. The ghost frowned and hissed, for it feared to lose its prey. In a short time, the child had fallen asleep again, and the woman once more began to look aloft. Then she rose, again climbed on the bench, and was about to lay the noose about her neck, when the soldier began to call out loudly and drum on the window-pane. Then he broke it and climbed into the room. The woman fell to the ground, and the ghost disappeared. The soldier recalled the woman to consciousness, and then he saw something hanging down from the beam like a cord without an end. Knowing that it belonged to the ghost of the hanged woman, he took and kept it. Then he said to the woman, "Take good care of your child. You have but one life to lose in this world." And with that he went out. Then it occurred to him that his horse and his baggage were still in the temple, and he went there to get them. When he came out of the village, there was the ghost waiting for him in the road. The ghost bowed and said, "I have been looking for a substitute for many years, and today, when it seemed as though I should really get one, you came along and spoiled my chances. So, there is nothing more for me to do. Yet there is something which I left behind me in my hurry. You surely must have found it, and I will ask you to return it to me. If I only have this one thing, my not having found a substitute will not worry me." Then the soldier showed her the rope and said with a laugh, "Is this the thing you mean? Why, if I were to give it back to you, then someone is sure to hang themselves, and that I could not allow." With these words he wound the rope around his arm, drove her off, and said, "Now be off with you." But then the ghost grew angry. Her face turned greenish-black, her hair fell in wild disorder down her neck, her eyes grew bloodshot, and her tongue hung far out of her mouth. She stretched forth both hands and tried to seize the soldier, but he struck out at her with his clenched fist. By mistake, he hit himself in the nose, and it began to bleed. Then he sprinkled a few drops of blood in her direction, and, since the ghosts cannot endure human blood, she ceased her attack, moved off a few paces, and began to abuse him. This she did for some time, until the cock in the village began to crow. Then the ghost disappeared. In the meantime, the farmer folk of the village had come to thank the soldier. It seems that after he had left the woman, her husband had come home and asked his wife what had happened. And then for the first time he had learned what had occurred. So they all set out together along the road in order to look for the soldier outside the village. When they found him, he was still beating the air with his fists and talking wildly. So they called out to him, and he told them what had taken place. The rope could still be seen on his bare arm, yet it had grown fast to it and surrounded it in the shape of a red ring of flesh. The day was just dawning, so the soldier swung himself into his saddle and rode away. Note, this tale has been handed down traditionally and is given as told among the people. The punishment of greed. Once upon a time, there lived a man south of the Yangtze Kiang. He had taken a position as a teacher in Suchufu, on the border of Shantung. But when he got there, he found that the schoolhouse had not yet been completed, yet a 2-story building in the neighborhood had been rented, in which the teacher was to live and hold school in the meantime. This house stood outside the village, not far from the riverbank. A broad plain, overgrown with tangled brush, stretched out from it on every side. The teacher was pleased with the view. Well, one evening he was standing in the door of his house watching the sun go down. The smoke that rose from the village chimneys gradually merged with the twilight shadows. All the noises of the day had died away. Suddenly, off in the distance, along the river bank, he beheld a fiery gleam. He hurried away at once in order to see what it might be, and there, on the bank, he found a wooden coffin, from which came the radiance he had noticed. Thought the teacher to himself, "The jewels with which they adorn the dead on their journey shine by night. Perhaps there are gems in the coffin." And greed awoke in his heart, and he forgot that a coffin is a resting place of the dead and should be respected. He took up a large stone, broke the cover of the coffin, and bent over to look more closely. And there in the coffin lay a youth. His face was as white as paper. He wore a mourning turban on his head, his body was wrapped in hempen garments, and he wore straw sandals on his feet. The teacher was greatly frightened and turned to go away, but the corpse had already raised itself to a sitting posture. Then the teacher's fear got the better of him, and he began to run, and the corpse climbed out of its coffin and ran after him. Fortunately, the house was not far away, The teacher ran as fast as he could, flew up the steps, and locked the door after him. Gradually, he caught his breath again. Outside, there was not a sound to be heard. So he thought that perhaps the corpse had not followed him all the way. He opened the window and peered down. The corpse was leaning against the wall of the house. Suddenly it saw that the window had been opened, and with one leap it bounded up and in through it. Overcome by terror, the teacher fell down the stairs of the house and rolled unconscious to the bottom of the flight. And when he did so, the corpse fell down on the floor of the room above. At the time, the school children had all long since gone home, and the owner of the house lived in another dwelling, so that no one knew anything about what had happened. On the following morning, the children came to school as usual. They found the door locked, and when they called, no one answered. Then they broke down the door and found their teacher lying unconscious on the ground. They sprinkled him with ginger, but it took a long time before he woke from his coma. When they asked, he told them all that had occurred. Then they all went upstairs and took away the corpse. It was taken outside the village limits and burned, and the bones which remained were once more laid in the coffin. But the teacher said with a sigh, "Because of a moment's greed, I nearly lost my life." He resigned his position, returned home, and never, through all the days of his life, did he speak of gain again. Note: the corpse wears a mourning turban and is dressed in mourning. According to local tradition, young people who die before their parents are laid in their coffins clad in mourning, so that even in death they may do their duty and be able to mourn their parents when the latter shall have died. The tale is taken from the Suzhi here. The Night on the Battlefield. Once upon a time there was a merchant who was wandering toward Shantung with his wares along the road from the south. At about the second watch of the night, a heavy storm blew up from the north, and he chanced to see an inn at one side of the road, whose lights were just being lit. He went in to get something to drink and order lodgings for the night, but the folk at the inn raised objections. Yet an old man among them took pity on his unhappy situation and said, "We have just prepared a meal for warriors who have come a long distance, and we had no wine left to serve you. But there is a little side room here which is still free, and there you may stay overnight." With these words he led him into it. But the merchant could not sleep because of his hunger and thirst. Outside he could hear the noise of men and horses, and since all these proceedings did not seem quite natural to him, he got up and looked through a crack in the door, and he saw that the whole inn was filled with soldiers who were sitting on the ground, eating and drinking, and talking about campaigns of which he had never heard. After a time, they began calling to each other, "The general is coming," and far off in the distance could be heard the cries of his bodyguard. All the soldiers hurried out to receive him. Then the merchant saw a procession with many paper lanterns, and riding in their midst a man of martial appearance with a long beard. He dismounted, entered the inn, and took his place at the head of the board. The soldiers mounted guard at the door, awaiting his commands, and the innkeeper served food and drink, to which the general did full justice. When he had finished, his officers entered, and he said to them, "You have now been under way for some time. Go back to your men. I shall rest a little myself. It will be time enough to beat the assembly when the order to advance is given." The officers received his commands and withdrew. Then the general called out, "Send Asti in!" And a young officer entered from the left side of the house. The people of the inn locked the gates and withdrew for the night, while Asti conducted the long-haired general to a door at the left, through a crack of which shone the light of a lamp. The merchant stole from his room and looked through the crack in the door. Within the room was a bed of bamboo without covers or pillows. The lamp stood on the ground. The long-bearded general took hold of his head. It came off, and he placed it on the bed. Then Asti took hold of his arms. These also came off, and were carefully placed beside the head. Then the old general threw himself down on the bed crosswise, and Asti took hold of his body, which came apart below the thighs, and the two legs fell to the ground. Then the lamp went out. Overcome by terror, the merchant hurried back to his room as fast as he could, holding his sleeves before his eyes, and laid down on his bed, where he tossed about sleepless all night. At last he heard a cock crow in the distance. He was shivering. He took his sleeves from his face and saw that dawn was stealing along the sky. And when he looked about him, there he was, lying in the middle of a thick clump of brush. Round about him was a wilderness, not a house. Not even a grave was to be seen anywhere. In spite of being chilled, he ran about 3 miles till he came to the nearest inn. The innkeeper opened the door and asked him with astonishment where he came from at that early hour. So the merchant told him his experiences and inquired as to the sort of place at which he had spent the night. The innkeeper shook his head. "The whole neighborhood is covered with old battlefields," was his reply, "and all sorts of supernatural things take place on them after dark." Note, this tale is taken from the Sin, Tsihia. The Kingdom of the Ogres. In the land of Annam there once dwelt a man named Su, who sailed the seas as a merchant. Once his ship was suddenly driven on a distant shore by a great storm. It was a land of hills, broken by ravines and green with luxuriant foliage. Yet he could see something along the hills which looked like human dwellings. So he took some food with him and went ashore. No sooner had he entered the hills than he could see at either hand the entrances to caves, one close beside the other, like a row of beehives. So he stopped and looked into one of the openings, and in it sat 2 ogres, with teeth like spears and eyes like fiery lamps. They were just devouring a deer. The merchant was terrified by this sight and turned to flee, but the ogres had already noticed him, and they caught him and dragged him into their cave. Then they talked to each other with animal sounds, and were about to tear his clothes from his body and devour him. But the merchant hurriedly took a bag of bread and dried meat out and offered it to them. They divided it, ate it up, and it seemed to taste good to them. Then they once more went through the bag, but he gestured with his hand to show them that he had no more. Then he said, "Let me go. Aboard my ship I have frying pans and cooking pots, vinegar and spices. With these I could prepare your food." The ogres did not understand what he was saying, however, and were still ferocious. So he tried to make them understand in dumb show, and finally they seemed to get an idea of his meaning. So they went to the ship with him, and he brought his cooking gear to the cave, collected brushwood, made a fire, and cooked the remains of the deer. When it was done to a turn, he gave them some of it to eat, and the 2 creatures devoured it with the greatest satisfaction. Then they left the cave and closed the opening with a great rock. In a short space of time they returned with another deer they had caught. The merchant skinned it, fetched fresh water, washed the meat and cooked several kettles full of it. Suddenly in came a whole herd of ogres who devoured all he had cooked and became quite animated over their eating. They all kept pointing to the kettle which seemed too small to them. When 3 or 4 days had passed, one of the ogres dragged in an enormous cooking pot on his back, which was thenceforth used exclusively. Now the ogres crowded about the merchant, bringing him wolves and deer and antelopes, which he had to cook for them, and when the meat was done, they would call him to eat it with them. Thus a few weeks passed, and they gradually came to have such confidence in him that they let him run about freely, and the merchant listened to the sounds which they uttered, and learned to understand them. In fact, before very long, he was able to speak the language of the ogres himself. This pleased the latter greatly, and they brought him a young ogre girl and made her his wife. She gave him valuables and fruit to win his confidence, and in course of time they grew much attached to each other. One day the ogres all rose very early, and each one of them hung a string of radiant pearls about his neck. They ordered the merchant to be sure and cook a great quantity of meat. The merchant asked his wife what it all meant. "This will be a day of high festival," answered she. "We have invited the great king to a banquet." But to the other ogres she said, "The merchant has no string of pearls." Then each of the ogres gave him 5 pearls, and his wife added 10, so that he had 50 pearls in all. These his wife threaded and hung the pearl necklace about his neck, and there was not one of the pearls which was not worth at least several 100 ounces of silver. Then the merchant cooked the meat, and having done so, left the cave with the whole herd in order to receive the great king. They came to a broad cave, in the middle of which stood a huge block of stone, as smooth and even as a table. Round it were stone seats. The place of honor was covered with a leopard skin, and the rest of the seats with deer skins. Several dozen ogres were sitting around the cave in rank and file. Suddenly, a tremendous storm blew up, whirling around the dust in columns, and a monster appeared who had the figure of an ogre. The ogres all crowded out of the cave in a high state of excitement to receive him. The great king ran into the cave, sat down with his legs outstretched, and glanced about him with eyes as round as an eagle's. The whole herd followed him into the cave and stood at either hand of him, looking up to him and folding their arms across their breasts in the form of a cross in order to do him honor. The great king nodded, looked around and asked, "Are all the folk of the Woolmy Hills present?" The entire herd declared that they were. Then he saw the merchant and asked, "From whence does he hail?" His wife answered for him, and all spoke with praise of his art as a cook. A couple of ogres brought in the cooked meat and spread it out on the table. Then the great king ate of it till he could eat no more, praised it with his mouth full, and said that in the future they were always to furnish him with food of this kind. Then he looked at the merchant and asked, "Why is your necklace so short?" With these words he took 10 pearls from his own necklace, pearls as large and round as bullets of a blunderbuss. The merchant's wife quickly took them on his behalf and hung them around his neck, and the merchant crossed his arms like the ogres and spoke his thanks. Then the great king went off again, flying away like lightning on the storm. In the course of time, heaven sent the merchant children 2 boys and a girl. They all had a human form and did not resemble their mother. Gradually, the children learned to speak, and their father taught them the language of men. They grew up and were soon so strong that they could run across the hills as though on level ground. One day, the merchant's wife had gone out with one of the boys and the girl, and had been absent for half a day. The north wind was blowing briskly, and in the merchant's heart there awoke a longing for his old home. He took his son by the hand and went down to the seashore. There his old ship was still lying, so he climbed into it with his boy, and in a day and a night was back in Annam again. When he reached home, he loosened 2 of his pearls from his chain, and sold them for a great quantity of gold, so that he could keep house in handsome style. He gave his son the name of Panther, and when the boy was 14 years of age, he could lift 30 hundredweight with ease. Yet he was rough by nature, and fond of fighting. The general of Annam, astonished at his bravery, appointed him a colonel, and in putting down a revolt, his services were so meritorious that he was already a general of the 2nd rank when but 18. At about this time, another merchant was also driven ashore by a storm on the island of Woolmy. When he reached land, he saw a youth who asked him with astonishment, "Are you not from the Middle Kingdom?" The merchant told him how he had come to be driven ashore on the island, and the youth led him to a little cave in a secret valley. Then he brought deer flesh for him to eat and talked with him. He told him that his father had also come from Annam, and it turned out that his father was an old acquaintance of the man to whom he was talking. "We will have to wait until the wind blows from the north," said the youth. "Then I will come and escort you, and I will give you a message of greeting to take to my father and brother." "Why do you not go along yourself and hunt up your father?" asked the merchant. "My mother does not come from the Middle Kingdom," replied the youth. "She is different in speech and appearance, so it cannot well be." One day the wind blew strongly from the north, and the youth came and escorted the merchant to his ship, and ordered him, at parting, not to forget a single one of his words. When the merchant returned to Annam, he went to the palace of Panther, the general, and told him all that had happened. When Panther listened to him telling about his brother, he sobbed with bitter grief. Then he secured leave of absence and sailed out to sea with 2 soldiers. Suddenly, a typhoon arose, which lashed the waves until they spurted sky high. The ship turned turtle, and Panther fell into the sea. He was seized by a creature and flung up on a strand where there seemed to be dwellings. The creature who had seized him looked like an ogre, so Panther addressed him in the ogre tongue. The ogre, surprised, asked him who he was, and Panther told him his whole story. The ogre was pleased and said, "Walmy is my old home, but it lies about 8,000 miles away from here. This is the kingdom of the poisoned dragons." Then the ogre fetched a ship and had Panther seat himself in it, while he himself pushed the ship before him through the water so that it clove the waves like an arrow. It took a whole night, but in the morning a shoreline appeared to the north, and there on the strand stood a youth on lookout. Panther recognized his brother. He stepped ashore, and they clasped hands and wept. Then Panther turned around to thank the ogre, but the latter had already disappeared. Panther now asked after his mother and sister, and was told that both were well and happy, so he wanted to go to them with his brother. But the latter told him to wait, and went off alone. Not long after he came back with their mother and sister, and when they saw Panther, both wept with emotion. Panther now begged them to return with him to Annam. But his mother replied, "I fear that if I went, people would mock me because of my figure." "I am a high officer," replied Panther, "and people would not dare to insult you." So they all went down to the ship together with him. A favorable wind filled their sails, and they sped home swiftly as an arrow flies. On the 3rd day they reached land, but the people whom they encountered were all seized with terror and ran away. Then Panther took off his mantle and divided it among the 3 so that they could dress themselves. When they reached home, and the mother saw her husband again, she at once began to scold him violently because he had said not a word to her when he went away. The members of his family, who all came to greet the wife of the master of the house, did so with fear and trembling. But Panther advised his mother to learn the language of the Middle Kingdom, dress in silks, and accustom herself to human food. This she agreed to do, yet she and her daughter had men's clothing made for them. The brother and sister gradually grew more fair of complexion, and looked like the people of the Middle Kingdom. Panther's brother was named Leopard, and his sister Ogrechild. Both possessed great bodily strength, but Panther was not pleased to think that his brother was so uneducated, so he had him study. Leopard was highly gifted. He understood a book at first reading, yet he felt no inclination to become a man of learning. To shoot and to ride was what he best loved to do. So he rose to high rank as a professional soldier and finally married the daughter of a distinguished official. It was long before Ogrechild found a husband, because all suitors were afraid of their mother-in-law-to-be. But Ogrechild finally married one of her brother's subordinates. She could draw the strongest bow and strike the tiniest bird at a distance of 100 paces. Her arrow never fell to earth without having scored a hit. When her husband went out to battle, she always accompanied him, and that he finally became a general was largely due to her. Leopard was already a field marshal at the age of 30, and his mother accompanied him on his campaigns. When a dangerous enemy drew near, she buckled on armor and took a knife in her hand to meet him in place of her son. And among the enemies who encountered her, there was not a single one who did not flee from her in terror. Because of her courage, the emperor bestowed upon her the title of the Superwoman. Note: the ogres here mentioned are the primitive inhabitants of the island of Ceylon, also called Rakshas, who appear in legend as man-devouring monsters. The maiden who was stolen away. In the western portion of the old capital city of Luoyang, there was a ruined cloister in which stood an enormous pagoda, several hundred stories high. 3 or 4 people could still find room to stand on its very top. Not far from it, there lived a beautiful maiden, and one very hot summer's day, she was sitting in the courtyard of her home, trying to keep cool. And, as she sat there, a sudden cyclone came up and carried her off. When she opened her eyes, there she was on top of the pagoda, and beside her stood a young man in the dress of a student. He was very polite and affable, and said to her, "It seems as though heaven had meant to bring us together, and if you promise to marry me, we will be very happy." But to this the maiden would not agree. So the student said that until she changed her mind, she would have to remain on the pagoda top. Then he produced bread and wine for her to satisfy her hunger and thirst, and disappeared. Thereafter he appeared each day, and asked her whether she had changed her mind. And each day she told him she had not. When he went away, he always carefully closed the openings in the pagoda top with stones, and he had also removed some of the steps of the stairs, so that she could not climb down. And when he came to the pagoda top, he always brought her food and drink, and he also presented her with rouge and powder, dresses and mandarin coats, and all sorts of jewelry. He told her he had bought them in the marketplace, and he also hung up a great carbuncle stone, so that the pagoda top was bright by night as well as by day. The maiden had all that heart could wish, and yet she was not happy. But one day when he went away, he forgot to lock the window. The maiden spied on him without his knowing it, and saw that from a youth he turned himself into an ogre, with hair as red as madder and a face as black as coal. His eyeballs bulged out of their sockets, and his mouth looked like a dish full of blood. Crooked white fangs thrust themselves from his lips, and 2 wings grew from his shoulders. Spreading them, he flew down to earth, and at once turned into a man again. The maiden was seized with terror and burst into tears. Looking down from her pagoda, she saw a wanderer passing below. She called out, but the pagoda was so high that her voice did not carry down to him. She beckoned with her hand, but the wanderer did not look up. Then she could think of nothing else to do but to throw down the old clothes she had formerly worn. They fluttered through the air to the ground. The wanderer picked up the clothes. Then he looked up at the pagoda, and quite up at the very top he saw a tiny figure which looked like that of a girl. Yet he could not make out her features. For a long time he wondered who it might be, but in vain. Then he saw a light. "My neighbor's daughter," said he to himself, "was carried away by a magic storm. Is it possible that she may be up there?" So he took the clothes with him and showed them to the maiden's parents, and when they saw them, they burst into tears. But the maiden had a brother who was stronger and braver than anyone for miles around. When the tale had been told him, he took a heavy axe and went to the pagoda. There he hid himself in the tall grass and waited for what would happen. When the sun was just going down, along came a youth tramping the hill. Suddenly he turned into an ogre, spread his wings, and was about to fly. But the brother flung his axe at him and struck him on the arm. He began to roar loudly, and then fled to the western hills. But when the brother saw that it was impossible to climb the pagoda, he went back and enlisted the aid of several labourers. With them he returned the following morning, and they climbed up into the pagoda. Most of the steps of the stairway were in good condition, for the ogre had only destroyed those at the top. But they were able to get up with a ladder, and then the brother fetched down his sister and brought her safely home again. And that was the end of the enchantment. Note, in this tale the ogre is a yaksha or a fey tienyacha. The Flying Ogre. There once lived in Xianfu an old Buddhist monk who loved to wander in lonely places. In the course of his wanderings, he once came to the Cuckoo Nor, and there he saw a tree which was 1,000 feet high and many cords in breadth. It was hollow inside, and one could see the sky shining down into it from above. When he had gone on a few miles, he saw in the distance a girl in a red coat, barefoot and with unbound hair, who was running as fast as the wind. In a moment she stood before him. "Take pity on me and save my life," said she to him. When the monk asked her what was the trouble, she replied, "A man is pursuing me. If you will tell him you have not seen me, I will be grateful to you all my life long." With that, she ran up to the hollow tree and crawled into it. When the monk had gone a little further, he met one who rode an armoured steed. He wore a garment of gold, a bow was slung across his shoulders, and a sword hung at his side. His horse ran with the speed of lightning, and covered a couple of miles with every step. Whether it ran in the air or on the ground, its speed was the same. "Have you seen the girl in the red coat?" asked the stranger. And when the monk replied that he had seen nothing, the other continued, "Bons, you should not lie. This girl is not a human being, but a flying ogre. Of flying ogres there are thousands of varieties who bring ruin to people everywhere. I have already slain a countless number of them and have pretty well done away with them. But this one is the worst of all. Last night the Lord of the Heavens gave me a triple command, and that is the reason I have hurried down from the skies. There are 8,000 of us under way in all directions to catch this monster. If you do not tell the truth, monk, then you are sinning against heaven itself." Upon that the monk did not dare deceive him, but pointed to the hollow tree. The messenger of the skies dismounted, stepped into the tree and looked about him. Then he once more mounted his horse, which carried him up the hollow trunk and out at the end of the tree. The monk looked up and could see a small red flame come out of the tree top. It was followed by the messenger of the skies. Both rose up to the clouds and disappeared. After a time there fell a rain of blood. The ogre had probably been hit by an arrow or captured. Afterward, the monk told the tale to the scholar who wrote it down. Note: this flying ogre is also of the Yaksha tribe. The wild people who dwell in the southwest are masters of many black arts. They often lure men of the Middle Kingdom to their country by promising them their daughters in marriage. But their promises are not to be trusted. Once there was the son of a poor family who agreed to labor for 3 years for one of the wild men in order to become his son-in-law. At the end of that time, the wedding was celebrated, and the couple were given a little house for a home. But no sooner had they entered it than the wife warned her husband to be on his guard, since her parents did not like him and would seek to do him harm. In accordance with the custom, she entered the house first with a lighted lantern, but when the bridegroom followed her, she had disappeared. And thus it went day by day. During the daytime she was there, but when evening came, she disappeared. And one day, not long after they had been married, his wife said to him, "Tomorrow morning my mother celebrates her birthday, and you must go to congratulate her. They will offer you tea and food. The tea you may drink, but be sure not to touch any of the food. Keep this in mind." So the following day, the wife and husband went to her mother's home and offered their congratulations. Her parents seemed highly pleased and served them with tea and sweets. The son-in-law drank but ate nothing, though his wife's parents, with kind words and friendly gestures, kept urging him to help himself. At last, the son-in-law did not know what to do, and thought that surely they could mean him no ill, and seeing the fresh-caught eels and crabs on the plate before him, he ate a little of them. His wife gave him a reproachful glance, and he offered some excuse for taking his leave. But his mother-in-law said, "This is my birthday. You simply must taste my birthday noodles." With that, she placed a great dish before him, filled with noodles that looked like threads of silver, mingled with fat meat and spiced with fragrant mushrooms. During all the time he had been living in the country, the son-in-law had never yet seen such an appetizing dish. Its pleasant odor rose temptingly to his nostrils, and he could not resist raising his chopsticks. His wife glanced over at him, but he pretended that he did not see her. She coughed significantly, but he acted as though he did not hear. Finally she trod on his foot under the table, and then he regained control of himself. He had not as yet eaten half of the food and said, "My hunger is satisfied." Then he took leave and went off with his wife. "This is a serious matter," said the latter. "You would not listen to my words, and now you will surely have to die." But still he did not believe her, until he suddenly felt terrible pains, which soon grew unbearable, so that he fell to the ground unconscious. His wife at once hung him up by the feet from the beam of the roof, and put a panful of glowing charcoal under his body and a great jar of water, into which she had poured sesame oil, in front of the fire directly below his mouth. And when the fire had heated him thoroughly, he suddenly opened his mouth, and can you imagine what came out of it? A squirming, crawling mass of poisonous worms, centipedes, toads and tadpoles, who all fell into the jar of water. Then his wife untied him, carried him to bed, and gave him wine mingled with relgar to drink. Then he recovered. "What you ate in the belief that they were eels and crabs," said his wife, "were nothing but toads and tadpoles, and the birthday noodles were poisonous worms and centipedes. But you must continue to be careful. My parents know that you have not died, and they will think up other evil plans." A few days later his father-in-law said to him, "There is a large tree growing on the precipice which juts over the cave. In it is the nest of the phoenix. You are still young and able to climb, so go there quickly and fetch me the eggs." His son-in-law went home and told his wife. "Take long bamboo poles," said she, "and tie them together, and fasten a curved sword at the top. And take these 9 loaves of bread, and these hen's eggs, there are 7 times 7 of them. Carry them along with you in a basket. When you come to the spot, you will see a large nest up in the branches. Do not climb the tree, but chop it down with the curved sword. Then throw away your poles and run for dear life. Should a monster appear and follow you, throw him the loaves of bread, 3 loaves at a time, and finally throw down the eggs on the ground and make for home as quickly as you can. In this way you may escape the danger which threatens you." The man noted all she said exactly and went. and sure enough he saw the bird's nest. It was as large as a round pavilion. Then he tied his curved sword to the poles, chopped at the tree with all his strength, laid down his poles on the ground and never looked around, but ran for dear life. Suddenly he heard the roaring of a thunderstorm rising above him. When he looked up, he saw a great dragon, many fathoms long, and some 10 feet across. His eyes gleamed like 2 lamps, and he was spitting fire and flame from his maw. He had stretched out 2 feelers and was feeling along the ground. Then the man swiftly flung the loaves into the air. The dragon caught them, and it took a little time before he had devoured them. But no sooner had the man gained a few steps than the dragon once more came flying after him. Then he flung him more loaves, and when the loaves came to an end, he turned over his basket so that the eggs rolled over the ground. The dragon had not yet satisfied his hunger and opened his greedy jaws wide. When he suddenly caught sight of the eggs, he descended from the air, and since the eggs were scattered round about, it took some time before he had sucked them all. In the meantime, the man succeeded in escaping to his home. When he entered the door and saw his wife, he said to her, amid sobs, "It was all I could do to escape, and I am lucky not to be in the dragon's stomach. If this sort of thing keeps up much longer, I am bound to die." With these words, he kneeled and begged his wife pitifully to save his life. "Where is your home?" asked his wife. "My home is about 100 miles away from here, in the Middle Kingdom, and my old mother is still living. The only thing that worries me is that we are so poor." His wife said, "I will flee with you, and we will find your mother, and waste no regrets on your poverty." With that, she gathered up all the house held in the way of pearls and precious stones, put them in a bag, and had her husband tie it around his waist. Then she also gave him an umbrella, and in the middle of the night they climbed the wall with the aid of a ladder and stole away. His wife had also said to him, "Take the umbrella on your back and run as fast as ever you can. Do not open it and do not look around. I will follow you in secret." So he turned north and ran with all his might and main. He had been running for a day and a night, had covered nearly 100 miles, and passed the boundaries of the wild people's country, when his legs gave out and he grew hungry. Before him lay a mountain village. He stopped at the village gate to rest, drew some food from his pocket, and began to eat. And he looked around without being able to see his wife. Said he to himself, "Perhaps she has deceived me after all, and is not coming with me." After he had finished eating, he took a drink from a spring, and painfully dragged himself further. When the heat of the day was greatest, a violent mountain rain suddenly began to fall. In his haste, he forgot what his wife had told him and opened his umbrella. And out fell his wife upon the ground. She reproached him. "Once more, you have not listened to my advice. Now the damage has been done." Quickly she told him to go to the village, and there to buy a white cock, 7 black teacups, and half a length of red nettlecloth. "Do not be sparing of the silver pieces in your pocket," she cried after him as he went off. He went to the village, attended to everything, and came back. The woman tore the cloth apart, made a coat of it, and put it on. No sooner had they walked a few miles before they could see a red cloud rising up in the south, like a flying bird. "That is my mother," said the woman. In a moment the cloud was overhead. Then the woman took the black teacups and threw them at it. 7. She threw, and 7 fell to earth again. And then they could hear the mother in the cloud weeping and scolding, and thereupon the cloud disappeared. They went on for about 4 hours. Then they heard a sound like the noise of silk being torn, and could see a cloud as black as ink, which was rushing up against the wind. "Alas, that is my father," said the woman. "This is a matter of life and death, for he will not let us be." Because of my love for you, I will now have to disobey the holiest of laws." With these words, she quickly seized the white cock, separated its head from its body, and flung the head into the air. At once the black cloud dissolved, and her father's body, the head severed from the trunk, fell down by the edge of the road. Then the woman wept bitterly, and when she had wept her fill, they buried the corpse. Thereupon they went together to her husband's home, where they found his old mother still living. They then undid the bag of pearls and jewels, bought a piece of good ground, built a fine house, and became wealthy and respected members of the community. Note: Riaga. The Chinese believe that Riaga is a mithridate and tonic. The Sorcerer of the White Lotus. Once upon a time, there was a sorcerer who belonged to the White Lotus Lodge. He knew how to deceive the multitude with his black arts, and many who wished to learn the secret of his enchantments became his pupils. One day the sorcerer wished to go out. He placed a bowl, which he covered with another bowl, in the hall of his house, and ordered his pupils to watch it. But he warned them against uncovering the bowl to see what might be in it. No sooner had he gone than the pupils uncovered the bowl and saw that it was filled with clear water. And floating on the water was a little ship made of straw, with real masts and sails. They were surprised and pushed it with their fingers till it upset. Then they quickly righted it again and once more covered the bowl. By that time the sorcerer was already standing among them. He was angry and scolded them, saying, "Why did you disobey my command?" His pupils rose and denied that they had done so. But the sorcerer answered, "Did not my ship turn turtle at sea, and yet you try to deceive me?" On another evening he lit a giant candle in his room and ordered his pupils to watch it lest it be blown out by the wind. It must have been at the second watch of the night, and the sorcerer had not yet come back. The pupils grew tired and sleepy, so they went to bed and gradually fell asleep. When they woke up again, the candle had gone out. So they rose quickly and relit it. But the sorcerer was already in the room, and again he scolded them. "Truly we did not sleep. How could the light have gone out?" Angrily the sorcerer replied, "You let me walk 15 miles in the dark, and still you can talk such nonsense." Then his pupils were very much frightened. In the course of time, one of his pupils insulted the sorcerer. The latter made note of the insult, but said nothing. Soon after, he told the pupil to feed the swine, and no sooner had he entered the sty than his master turned him into a pig. The sorcerer then at once called in a butcher, sold the pig to the man, and he went the way of all pigs who go to the butcher. One day, this pupil's father turned up to ask after his son, for he had not come back to his home for a long time. The sorcerer told him that his son had left him long ago. The father returned home and inquired everywhere for his son, without success. But one of his son's fellow pupils, who knew of the matter, informed the father. So the father complained to the district mandarin. The latter, however, feared that the sorcerer might make himself invisible. He did not dare to have him arrested, but informed his superior and begged for 1,000 well-armed soldiers. These surrounded the sorcerer's home and seized him, together with his wife and child. All three were put into wooden cages to be transported to the capital. The road wound through the mountains, and in the midst of the hills up came a giant as large as a tree, with eyes like saucers, a mouth like a plate, and teeth a foot long. The soldiers stood there trembling and did not dare to move. Said the sorcerer, "That is a mountain spirit. My wife will be able to drive him off." They did as he suggested, unchained the woman, and she took a spear and went to meet the giant. The latter was angered, and he swallowed her tooth and nail. This frightened the rest all the more. The sorcerer said, Well, if he has done away with my wife, then it is my son's turn. So they let the son out of his cage. But the giant swallowed him in the same way. The rest all looked on without knowing what to do. The sorcerer then wept with rage and said, "First he destroys my wife, and then my son. If only he might be punished for it, but I am the only one who can punish him." And, sure enough, they took him out of his cage too, gave him a sword, and sent him out against the giant. The sorcerer and the giant fought with each other for a time, and at last the giant seized the sorcerer, thrust him into his maw, stretched his neck, and swallowed him. Then he went his way contentedly. And now, when it was too late, the soldiers realized that the sorcerer had tricked them. Note: the Lodge of the White Lotus is one of the secret revolutionary societies of China. It harks back to Tongtianzhou, Jishu as its founder. Compare note to number 18. The mountain spirit, of course, is an optical illusion called up by the sorcerer, by means of which he frees his family and himself from the soldiers. The Three Evils. Once upon a time, in the old days, there lived a young man by the name of Zhu Chu. He was of more than ordinary strength, and no one could withstand him. He was also wild and undisciplined, and wherever he was, quarrels and brawls arose. Yet the village elders never ventured to punish him seriously. He wore a high hat on his head, adorned with 2 pheasants' wings. His garments were woven of embroidered silk, and at his side hung the dragon-spring sword. He was given to play and to drinking, and his hand was inclined to take that which belonged to others. Whoever offended him had reason to dread the consequences, and he always mixed into disputes in which others were engaged. Thus he kept it up for years, and was a pest throughout the neighborhood. Then a new mandarin came to that district. When he had arrived, he first went quietly about the country and listened to the people's complaints, and they told him that there were 3 great evils in that district. Then he clothed himself in coarse garments and wept before Deshu Chu's door. Deshu Shu was just coming from the tavern, where he had been drinking. He was slapping his sword and singing in a loud voice. When he reached his house, he asked, "Who is weeping here so pitifully?" And the mandarin replied, "I am weeping because of the people's distress." Then Deshu Chu saw him and broke out into loud laughter. "You are mistaken, my friend," said he. "Revolt is seething round about us like boiling water in a kettle. But here, in our little corner of the land, all is quiet and peaceful. The harvest has been abundant, corn is plentiful, and all go happily about their work. When you talk to me about distress, I have to think of the man who groans without being sick. And who are you? Tell me that. Who, instead of grieving for yourself, are grieving for others? And what are you doing before my door?" "I am the new mandarin," replied the other. "Since I left my litter, I have been looking about in the neighborhood. I find the people are honest and simple in their way of life, and everyone has sufficient to wear and to eat. This is all just as you state. Yet, strange to say, when the elders come together, they always sigh and complain, and if they are asked why, they answer, 'There are 3 great evils in our district. I have come to ask you to do away with 2 of them. As to the 3rd, perhaps I had better remain silent. And this is the reason I weep before your door.'" "Well, what are these evils?" answered the Shu-Chu. "Speak freely, and tell me openly all that you know." "The first evil," said the mandarin, "is the evil dragon at the long bridge, who causes the water to rise so that man and beast are drowned in the river. The second evil is the tiger with the white forehead who dwells in the hills. And the 3rd evil, Shu-Chu, is yourself. Then the blush of shame mounted to the man's cheek, and he bowed and said, "You have come here from afar to be the mandarin of this district, and yet you feel such sympathy for the people? I was born in this place, and yet I have only made our elders grieve. What sort of a creature must I be? I beg that you will return home again. I will see to it that matters improve." Then he ran without stopping to the hills and hunted the tiger out of his cave. The latter leaped into the air so that the whole forest was shaken as though by a storm. Then he came rushing up, roaring, and stretching out his claws savagely to seize his enemy. Chu stepped back a pace, and the tiger lit on the ground directly in front of him. Then he thrust the tiger's neck to the ground with his left hand and beat him without stopping with his right, until he lay dead on the earth. Shu loaded the tiger on his back and went home. Then he went to the long bridge. He undressed, took his sword in his hand, and thus dived into the water. No sooner had he disappeared than there was a boiling and hissing, and the waves began to foam and billow. It sounded like the mad beating of thousands of hoofs. After a time, a stream of blood shot up from the depths, and the water of the river turned red. Then Chu, holding the dragon in his hand, rose out of the waves. He went to the mandarin and reported, with a bow, "I have cut off the dragon's head, and have also done away with the tiger. Thus I have happily accomplished your command. And now I shall wander away, so that you may be rid of the third evil as well. Lord, watch over my country, and tell the elders that they need sorrow no more." When he had said this, he enlisted as a soldier. In combat against the robbers, he gained a great reputation, and once, when the latter were pressing him hard, and he saw that he could not save himself, he bowed to the east and said, "The day has come at last when I can atone for my sin with my life." Then he offered his neck to the sword and died. Note, a legendary tale rather than a folk story with a fine moral. At the beginning of his reign, Duke Ging of Si loved to draw heroes about him. Among those whom he attached to him were three of quite extraordinary bravery. The first was named Gung Sun Disha, the second Tian Kai Jiang, the third Gu Ai Dishi. All three were highly honored by the prince, but the honor paid them made them presumptuous. They kept the court in a turmoil and overstepped the bounds of respect which lie between a prince and his servants. At the time, Yan Dishi was Chancellor of Si. The Duke consulted him as to what would be best to do, and the Chancellor advised him to give a great court banquet and invite all his courtiers. On the table, the choicest dish of all, stood a platter holding 4 magnificent peaches. Then, in accordance with his Chancellor's advice, the Duke rose and said, "Here are some magnificent peaches, but I cannot give one to each of you. Only those most worthy may eat of them. I myself reign over the land, and am the first among the princes of the empire. I have been successful in holding my possessions and power, and that is my merit. Hence, one of the peaches falls to me. Yan Dishi sits here as my chancellor. He regulates communications with foreign lands and keeps the peace among the people. He has made my kingdom powerful among the kingdoms of the earth. That is his merit, and hence the second peach falls to him. Now there are but 2 peaches left, yet I cannot tell which ones among you are the worthiest. You may rise yourselves and tell us of your merits. But whoever has performed no great deeds, let him hold his tongue." Then Gungsundia beat upon his sword, rose up and said, "I am the prince's captain general. In the south I besiege the kingdom of Lu. In the west I conquered the kingdom of Disin. In the north, I captured the army of Yan. All the princes of the east come to the duke's court and acknowledge the overlordship of sea. That is my merit. I do not know whether it deserves a peach." The duke replied, "Great is your merit. A peach is your just due." Then Tian Kai Jiang rose, beat on the table, and cried, "I have fought 100 battles in the army of the prince. I have slain the enemy's general-in-chief and captured the enemy's flag. I have extended the borders of the duke's land till the size of his realm has been increased by 1,000 miles. How is it with my merit?" The duke said, "Great is your merit. A peach is your just due." Then Gu IDC arose. His eyes started from their sockets, and he shouted with a loud voice, "Once!" When the duke was crossing the Yellow River, wind and waters rose. A river dragon snapped up one of the steeds of the chariot and tore it away. The ferry boat rocked like a sieve and was about to capsize. Then I took my sword and leaped into the stream. I fought with the dragon in the midst of the foaming waves. And by reason of my strength, I managed to kill him, though my eyes stood out of my head with my exertions. Then I came to the surface, with the dragon's head in one hand, and holding the rein of the rescued horse in the other, and I had saved my prince from drowning. Whenever our country was at war with neighboring states, I refused no service. I commanded the van. I fought in single combat. Never did I turn my back on the foe. Once the prince's chariot stuck fast in the swamp, and the enemy hurried up on all sides. I pulled the chariot out and drove off the hostile mercenaries. Since I have been in the prince's service, I have saved his life more than once. I grant that my merit is not to be compared with that of the prince and that of the chancellor. Yet it is greater than that of my 2 companions. Both have received peaches, while I must do without. This means that real merit is not rewarded, and that the duke looks on me with disfavor. And in such case, how may I ever show myself at court again?" With these words, he drew his sword and killed himself. Then Gongsun Jaya rose, bowed twice, and said with a sigh, "Both my merit and that of Tian Kai Jiang does not compare with Gu Ai-Jisi's, and yet the peaches were given us. We have been rewarded beyond our deserts, and such reward is shameful. Hence it is better to die than to live dishonored." He took his sword and swung it, and his own head rolled on the sand. Tian Kai Jiang looked up and uttered a groan of disgust. He blew the breath from his mouth in front of him like a rainbow, and his hair rose on end with rage. Then he took sword in hand and said, "We 3 have always served our prince bravely. We were like the same flesh and blood. The others are dead, and it is my duty not to survive them." And he thrust his sword into his throat and died. The duke sighed incessantly and commanded that they be given a splendid burial. A brave hero values his honor more than his life. The chancellor knew this, and that was why he purposely arranged to incite the 3 heroes to kill themselves by means of the 2 peaches. Note, Duke Ging of Tsi, Eastern Shantung, was an older contemporary of Confucius. The Chancellor Yan Dishi, who is the reputed author of a work on philosophy, is the same who prevented the appointment of Confucius at the court of Xi. At the time of the 7 empires, there lived a man by the name of Xi Men Bao, who was a governor on the Yellow River. In this district, the river god was held in high honor. The sorcerers and witches who dwelt there said, "Every year the river god looks for a bride, who must be selected from among the people. If she be not found, then wind and rain will not come at the proper seasons, and there will be scanty crops and floods. And then When a girl came of age in some wealthy family, the sorcerers would say that she should be selected, whereupon her parents, who wished to protect their daughter, would bribe them with large sums of money to look for someone else, till the sorcerers would give in and order the rich folk to share the expense of buying some poor girl to be cast into the river. The remainder of the money they would keep for themselves as their profit on the transaction. But whoever would not pay, their daughter was chosen to be the bride of the river god, and was forced to accept the wedding gifts which the sorcerers brought her. The people of the district chafed grievously under this custom. Now when Seaman entered into office, he heard of this evil custom. He had the sorcerers come before him and said, "See to it that you let me know when the day of the river god's wedding comes. For I myself wish to be present to honor the god. This will please him, and in return he will shower blessings on my people." With that he dismissed them, and the sorcerers were full of praise for his piety. So when the day arrived, they gave him notice. Seaman dressed himself in his robes of ceremony, entered his chariot, and drove to the river in festival procession. The elders of the people, as well as the sorcerers and the witches, were all there, and from far and near men, women, and children had flocked together in order to see the show. The sorcerers placed the river bride on a couch, adorned her with her bridal jewels, and kettle drums, snare drums, and merry airs vied with each other in joyful sound. They were about to thrust the couch into the stream, and the girl's parents said farewell to her amid tears. But Seaman bade them wait and said, "Do not be in such a hurry. I have appeared in person to escort the bride, hence everything must be done solemnly and in order. First, someone must go to the river god's castle, and let him know that he may come himself and fetch his bride." And with these words he looked at a witch and said, "You may go." The witch hesitated, but he ordered his servants to seize her and thrust her into the stream, after which about an hour went by. "That woman did not understand her business," continued Seaman, "or else she would have been back long ago." And with that he looked at one of the sorcerers and added, "Do you go and do better." The sorcerer paled with fear, but Seaman had him seized and cast into the river. Again, half an hour went by. Then Seaman pretended to be uneasy. "Both of them have made a botch of their errand," said he, "and are causing the bride to wait in vain." Once more he looked at a sorcerer and said, "Do you go and hunt them up." But the sorcerer flung himself on the ground and begged for mercy, and all the rest of the sorcerers and witches knelt to him in a row and pleaded for grace, and they took an oath that they would never again seek a bride for the river god. Then Seaman held his hand and sent the girl back to her home, and the evil custom was at an end forever. Note Seaman. Bao was an historical personage who lived 5 centuries before Christ. Liang Dishang Liang was a native of one of those states which had been destroyed by the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, and Dishang Liang determined to do a deed for his dead king's sake, and to that end gathered followers with whom to slay Qin Shi Huang. Once Qin Shi Huang was making a progress through the country. When he came to the plain of Bolang, Chang Liang armed his people with iron maces in order to kill him. But Qin Shi Huang always had 2 traveling coaches which were exactly alike in appearance. In one of them he sat himself, while in the other was seated another person. Dushang Liang and his followers met the decoy wagon, and Chang Liang was forced to flee from the emperor's rage. He came to a ruined bridge. An icy wind was blowing, and the snowflakes were whirling through the air. There he met an old man wearing a black turban and a yellow gown. The old man let one of his shoes fall into the water, looked at Dushang Liang and said, "Fetch it out, little one." Liang controlled himself, fetched out the shoe, and brought it to the old man. The latter stretched out his foot to allow Liang to put it on, which he did in a respectful manner. This pleased the old man, and he said, "Little one, something may be made of you. Come here tomorrow morning early, and I will have something for you." The following morning, at break of dawn, Liang appeared, but the old man was already there, and reproached him. "You are too late. Today I will tell you nothing. Tomorrow you must come earlier." So it went on for 3 days, and Liang's patience was not exhausted. Then the old man was satisfied, brought forth the Book of Hidden Compliments, and gave it to him. "You must read it," said he, "and then you will be able to rule a great emperor. When your task is completed, seek me at the foot of the Guchong mountain. There you will find a yellow stone, and I will be by that yellow stone." Liang took the book and aided the ancestor of the Han dynasty to conquer the empire. The emperor made him a count. From that time forward, Liang ate no human food and concentrated in spirit. He kept company with the 4 Whitebeards of the Shang mountain, and with them shared the sunset roses in the clouds. Once he met 2 boys who were singing and dancing. "Green the garments you should wear, if to heaven's gate you'd fare. There the golden mother greet, bow before the wood lord's feet." When Liang heard this, he bowed before the youths, and said to his friends, "Those are angel children of the King Father of the East. The golden mother is the Queen of the West. The Lord of Wood is the King Father of the East. They are the 2 primal powers, the parents of all that is male and female, the root and fountain of heaven and earth, to whom all that has life is indebted for its creation and nourishment. The Lord of Wood is the master of all the male saints. The Golden Mother is the mistress of all the female saints. Whoever would gain immortality must first greet the Golden Mother and then bow before the King Father. Then he may rise up to the 3 pure ones and stand in the presence of the highest. The song of the angel children shows the manner in which the hidden knowledge may be acquired. At about that time, the emperor was induced to have some of his faithful servants slain. Then Liang left his service and went to the Guchong mountain. There he found the old man by the yellow stone, gained the hidden knowledge, returned home, and, feigning illness, loosed his soul from his body and disappeared. Later, when the rebellion of the Red Eyebrows broke out, his tomb was opened, but all that was found within it was a yellow stone. Liang was wandering with Laozi in the invisible world. Once his grandson Daoling went to Kunlun Mountain in order to visit the Queen Mother of the West. There he met Liang. Daoling gained power over demons and spirits and became the first Taoist pope. And the secret of his power has been handed down in his family from generation to generation. Note, in a yellow robe is an indication of Taoism. Compare with number 38, the Book of Hidden Compliments. Yin Fu Jing. Compare with Lia Ji. Introduction. At the time of the last emperor of the Sui dynasty, the power was in the hands of the emperor's uncle, Yang Su. He was proud and extravagant. In his hall stood choruses of singers and bands of dancing girls, and serving maids stood ready to obey his least sign. When the great lords of the empire came to visit him, he remained comfortably seated on his couch while he received them. In those days there lived a bold hero named Li Xing. He came to see Yang Su in humble clothes in order to bring him a plan for the quieting of the empire. He made a low bow, to which Yang Su did not reply, and then he said, The empire is about to be troubled by dissension, and heroes are everywhere taking up arms. You are the highest servant of the imperial house. It should be your duty to gather the bravest around the throne, and you should not rebuff people by your haughtiness." When Yang Su heard him speak in this fashion, he collected himself, rose from his place, and spoke to him in a friendly manner. Li Dixing handed him a memorial, and Yang Su entered into talk with him concerning all sorts of things. A serving maid of extraordinary beauty stood beside them. She held a red flabrum in her hand and kept her eyes fixed on Li Dixing. The latter at length took his leave and returned to his inn. Later in the day, someone knocked at his door. He looked out, and there, before the door, stood a person turbaned and gowned in purple, and carrying a bag slung from a stick across his shoulder. Li Dixing asked who it was, and received the answer, "I am the fan-bearer of Yang Su." With that, she entered the room, threw back her mantle, and took off her turban. Li Dixing saw that she was a maiden of 18 or 19. She bowed to him, and when he had replied to her greeting, she began, "I have dwelt in the house of Yang Su for a long time, and have seen many famous people, but none who could equal you. I will serve you wherever you go." Li Dixing answered, "The minister is powerful. I am afraid that we will plunge ourselves into misfortune. He is a living corpse, in whom the breath of life grows scant," said the fan-bearer, "and we need not fear him." He asked her name, and she said it was Dishang, and that she was the oldest among her brothers and sisters. And when he looked at her and considered her courageous behavior and her sensible words, he realized that she was a girl of heroic caste, and they agreed to marry and make their escape from the city in secret. The fan-bearer put on men's clothes, and they mounted horses and rode away. They had determined to go to Taiyuan-fu. On the following day, they stopped at an inn. They had their room put in order, and made a fire on the hearth to cook their meal. The fan-bearer was combing her hair. It was so long that it swept the ground, and so shining that you could see your face in it. Li Dixing had just left the room to groom the horses. Suddenly, a man who had a long, curling moustache like a dragon made his appearance. He came along riding on a lame mule, threw down his leather bag on the ground in front of the hearth, took a pillow, made himself comfortable on a couch, and watched the fan-bearer as she combed her hair. Li Dixing saw him and grew angry, but the fan-bearer had at once seen through the stranger. She motioned Li Dixing to control himself, quickly finished combing her hair, and tied it in a knot. Then she greeted the guest and asked his name. He told her that he was named Dishang. "Why, my name is also Dishang," said she, "so we must be relatives." Thereupon she bowed to him as her elder brother. "How many are there of you brothers?" she then inquired. "I am the third," he answered. "And you?" "I am the oldest sister." "How fortunate that I should have found a sister today," said the stranger, highly pleased. Then the fan-bearer called to Li Dixing through the door and said, "Come in. I wish to present my third brother to you." Then Li Dixing came in and greeted him. They sat down beside each other, and the stranger asked, "What have you to eat?" "A leg of mutton," was the answer. "I am quite hungry," said the stranger. So Li Jing went to the market and brought bread and wine. The stranger drew out his dagger, cut the meat, and they all ate in company. When they had finished, he fed the rest of the meat to his mule. Then he said, "Sir Li, you seem to be a moneyless knight. How did you happen to meet my sister?" Li Jing told him how it had occurred. "And where do you wish to go now?" "To Taiyuan-fu," was the answer, said the stranger. "You do not seem to be an ordinary fellow. Have you heard anything regarding a hero who is supposed to be in this neighborhood? Li Deshing answered, Yes, indeed. I know of one whom heaven seems destined to rule. And who might he be? Inquired the other. He is the son of Duke Li Yuan of Tung, and he is no more than 20 years of age. Could you present him to me sometime? Asked the stranger. And when Li Deshing has assured him he could, he continued, the astrologers say that a special sign has been noticed in the air above Taiyuanfu. Perhaps it is caused by the very man. Tomorrow you may await me at the Fenyang Bridge. With these words he mounted his mule and rode away, and he rode so swiftly that he seemed to be flying. The fan-bearer said to him, He is not a pleasant customer to deal with. I noticed that at first he had no good intentions. That is why I united him to us by bonds of relationship. Then they set out together for Taiyuanfu, and at the appointed place, sure enough, they met Dragonbeard. Li Deshing had an old friend, a companion of the Prince of Tang. He presented the stranger to this friend, named Liu Wenzing, saying, This stranger is able to foretell the future from the lines of the face, and would like to see the prince. Thereupon, Liu Wenzing took him in to the prince. The prince was clothed in a simple indoor robe, but there was something impressive about him, which made him remarked among all others. When the stranger saw him, he fell into a profound silence, and his face turned grey. After he had drunk a few flagons of wine, he took his leave. That man is a true ruler, he told Li Deshing. I am almost certain of the fact, but to be sure my friend must also see him. Then he arranged to meet Li Deshing on a certain day at a certain inn. When you see this mule before the door, together with a very lean jackass, then you may be certain I am there with my friend. On the day set, Li Deshing went there, and, sure enough, he saw the mule and the jackass before the door. He gathered up his robe and descended to the upper story of the inn. There sat old Dragonbeard and a Taoist priest over their wine. When the former saw Li Deshing, he was much pleased, bade him sit down and offered him wine. After they had pledged each other, all three returned to Liu Wenzing. He was engaged in a game of chess with the prince. The prince rose with respect and asked them to be seated. As soon as the Taoist priest saw his radiant and heroic countenance, he was disconcerted and greeted him with a low bow, saying, The game is up. When they took their leave, Dragonbeard said to Li Deshing, Go on to Xianfu, and when the time has come, ask for me at such and such a place. And with that, he went away snorting. Li Deshing and the fan-bearer packed up their belongings, left Taiyuanfu, and travelled on toward the west. At that time, Yang Su died, and great disturbance arose throughout the empire. In the course of a few days, Li Deshing and his wife reached the meeting place appointed by Dragonbeard. They knocked at a little wooden door, and out came a servant who led them through long passages. When they emerged, magnificent buildings arose before them, in front of which stood a crowd of slave girls. Then they entered a hall in which the most valuable dowry that could be imagined had been piled up. Mirrors, clothes, jewelry, all more beautiful than earth is wont to show. Handsome slave girls led them to the bath, and when they had changed their garments, their friend was announced. He stepped in, clad in silks and fox pelts, and looking almost like a dragon or a tiger. He greeted his guests with pleasure, and also called in his wife, who was of exceptional loveliness. A festive banquet was served, and all four sat down to it. The table was covered with the most expensive viands, so rare that they did not even know their names. Flagons and dishes and all the utensils were made of gold and jade, and ornamented with pearls and precious stones. 2 companies of girl musicians alternately blew flutes and chalamayas. They sang and danced, and it seemed to the visitors that they had been transported to the palace of the Lady of the Moon. The rainbow garments fluttered, and the dancing girls were beautiful beyond all the beauty of earth. After they had banqueted, Dragonbeard commanded his servitors to bring in couches upon which embroidered silken covers had been spread. And after they had seen everything worth seeing, he presented them with a book and a key. Then he said, "In this book are listed the valuables and the riches which I possess. I make you a wedding present of them. Nothing great may be undertaken without wealth, and it is my duty to endow my sister properly." My original intention had been to take the Middle Kingdom in hand and do something with it, but since a ruler has already arisen to reign over it, what is there to keep me in this country? For Prince Tung of Taiyuanfu is a real hero and will have restored order within a few years' time. You must both of you aid him, and you will be certain to rise to high honors. You, my sister, are not alone beautiful, but you have also the right way of looking at things. None other than yourself would have been able to recognize the true worth of Li Zhixing, and none other than Li Zhixing would have had the good fortune to encounter you. You will share the honors, which will be your husband's portion, and your name will be recorded in history. The treasures which I bestow upon you, you are to use to help the true ruler. Bear this in mind. And in 10 years' time, a glow will rise far away to the southeast, and it shall be a sign that I have reached my goal. Then you may pour a libation of wine in the direction of the southeast to wish me good fortune. Then, one after another, he had his servitors and slave girls greet Li Jing and the fan-bearer, and said to them, "This is your master and your mistress." When he had spoken these words, he took his wife's hand. They mounted 3 steeds which were held ready and rode away. Li Jing and his wife now established themselves in the house and found themselves possessed of countless wealth. They followed Prince Tang, who restored order to the empire and aided him with their money. Thus the great work was accomplished, and after peace had been restored throughout the empire, Li Zhixing was made Duke of Wei, and the fan-bearer became a duchess. Some 10 years later, the Duke was informed that in the empire beyond the sea, 1,000 ships had landed, an army of 100,000 armored soldiers. These had conquered the country, killed its prince, and set up their leader as its king. And order now reigned in that empire. Then the Duke knew that Dragonbeard had accomplished his aim. He told his wife, and they robed themselves in robes of ceremony and offered wine in order to wish him good fortune. And they saw a radiant crimson ray flash up on the southeastern horizon. No doubt Dragonbeard had sent it in answer, and both of them were very happy. Note, young Su died in the year 606 AD. The Li Zhixing of this tale has nothing in common with Li Zhixing, the father of Nozcha, no. 18. He lived as a historical personage, 500 and 609 AD. Li Yuan was the founder of the Tang dynasty, 500 and 665, 635 AD. His famous son, to whom he owed the throne, the Prince of Tang, was named Li Shimin. His father abdicated in 618 in his favor. This tale is not, of course, historical, but legendary. Compare with the introduction of the following. 1. At the time when the Tang dynasty reigned over the Middle Kingdom, there were master swordsmen of various kinds. Those who came first were the saints of the sword. They were able to take different shapes at will, and their swords were like strokes of lightning. Before their opponents knew they had been struck, their heads had already fallen. Yet these master swordsmen were men of lofty mind, and did not lightly mingle in the quarrels of the world. The second kind of master swordsman were the sword heroes. It was their custom to slay the unjust and to come to the aid of the oppressed. They wore a hidden dagger at their side and carried a leather bag at their belt. By magic means, they were able to turn human heads into flowing water. They could fly over roofs and walk up and down walls. And they came and went and left no trace. The swordsmen of the lowest sort were the mere bought slayers. They hired themselves out to those who wished to do away with their enemies, and death was an everyday matter to them. Old Dragonbeard must have been a master swordsman standing midway between those of the first and of the second order. Molo, however, of whom this story tells, was a sword hero. At that time there lived a young man named Tsui, whose father was a high official and the friend of the prince. And the father once sent his son to visit his princely friend who was ill. The son was young, handsome, and gifted. He went to carry out his father's instructions. When he entered the prince's palace, there stood 3 beautiful slave girls, who piled rosy peaches into a golden bowl, poured sugar over them, and presented them to him. After he had eaten, he took his leave, and his princely host ordered one of the slave girls, Rose Red by name, to escort him to the gate. As they went along, the young man kept looking back at her, and she smiled at him and made signs with her fingers. First, she would stretch out 3 fingers. Then she would turn her hand around 3 times, and finally she would point to a little mirror which she wore on her breast. When they parted, she whispered to him, "Do not forget me." When the young man reached home, his thoughts were all in confusion, and he sat down absent-mindedly like a wooden rooster. Now it happened that he had an old servant named Molo, who was an extraordinary being. "What is the trouble, master?" said he. "Why are you so sad? Do you not want to tell your old slave about it?" So the boy told him what had occurred, and also mentioned the signs the girl had made to him in secret. Said Molo, "When she stretched out 3 fingers, it meant that she is quartered in the 3rd court of the palace. When she turned round her hand 3 times, it meant the sum of 3 times 5 fingers, which is 15. When she pointed at the little mirror, she meant to say that on the 15th, when the moon is round as a mirror at midnight, you are to go for her." Then the young man was roused from his confused thoughts, and was so happy he could hardly control himself. But soon he grew sad again and said, "The prince's palace is shut off as though by an ocean. How would it be possible to win into it?" "Nothing easier," said Molo. "On the 15th, we will take 2 pieces of dark silk and wrap ourselves up in them, and thus I will carry you there. Yet there is a wild dog on guard at the slave girl's court who is strong as a tiger and watchful as a god. No one can pass by him, so he must be killed." When the appointed day had come, the servant said, "There is no one else in the world who can kill this dog but myself." Full of joy, the youth gave him meat and wine, and the old man took a chain hammer and disappeared with it. And after no more time had elapsed than it takes to eat a meal, he was back again and said, "The dog is dead, and there is nothing further to hinder us." At midnight they wrapped themselves in dark silk, and the old man carried the youth over the 10-fold walls which surrounded the palace. They reached the 3rd gateway, and the gate stood ajar. Then they saw the glow of a little lamp, and heard Rose Red sigh deeply. The entire court was silent and deserted. The youth raised the curtain and stepped into the room. Long and searchingly, Rose Red looked at him, then seized his hand. "I knew that you were intelligent and would understand my sign language. But what magic power have you at your disposal, that you were able to get here?" The youth told her in detail how Molo had helped him. "And where is Molo?" she asked. "Outside, before the curtain," was his answer. Then she called him in, and gave him wine to drink from a jade goblet and said, "I am of good family and have come here from far away. Force alone has made me a slave in this palace. I long to leave it. For though I have jasper chopsticks with which to eat, and drink my wine from golden flagons, though silk and satin rustle around me, and jewels of every kind are at my disposal, all these are but so many chains and fetters to hold me here. Dear Molo, you are endowed with magic powers. I beg you to save me in my distress. If you do, I will be glad to serve your master as a slave, and will never forget the favor you do me." The youth looked at Molo. Molo was quite willing. First, he asked permission to carry away Rose Red's gear and jewels in sacks and bags. 3 times he went away and returned until he had finished. Then he took his master and Rose Red upon his back and flew away with them over the steep walls. None of the watchmen of the prince's palace noticed anything out of the way. At home, the youth hid Rose Red in a distant room. When the prince discovered that one of his slave girls was missing and that one of his wild dogs had been killed, he said, "That must have been some powerful sword hero." And he gave strict orders that the matter should not be mentioned and that investigations should be made in secret. 2 years passed, and the youth no longer thought of any danger. Hence, when the flowers began to bloom in the spring, Rose Red went driving in a small wagon outside the city near the river. And there, one of the prince's servants saw her and informed his master. The latter sent for the youth, who, since he could not conceal the matter, told him the whole story exactly as it had happened. Said the prince, "The whole blame rests on Rose Red. I do not reproach you, yet since she is now your wife, I will let the whole matter rest, but Molo will have to suffer for it." Illustration. Then he took his master and Rose, Red up on his back and flew with them over the steep walls. Page 234. So he ordered 100 armored soldiers, with bows and swords, to surround the house of the youth, and under all circumstances to take Molo captive. But Molo drew his dagger and threw up the high wall. Thence he looked about him like a hawk. The arrows flew as thick as rain, but not one hit him, and in a moment he had disappeared, no one knew where. Yet 10 years later, one of his former master's servants ran across him in the south, where he was selling medicine, and he looked exactly as he had looked 10 years before. Note, this fairy tale has many features in common with the fairy tales of India, noticeably the use of the sign language, which the hero himself does not understand, but which is understood by his companion. The Golden Canister. In the days of the Tang dynasty, there lived a certain count in the camp at Ludshu. He had a slave who could play the lute admirably, and was also so well versed in reading and writing that the count employed her to indite his confidential letters. Once there was a great feast held in the camp, said the slave girl. The large kettle drum sounds so sad today. Some misfortune must surely have happened to the kettle drummer. The count sent for the kettle drummer and questioned him. My wife has died, he replied, yet I did not venture to ask for leave of absence. That is why, in spite of me, my kettle drum sounded so sad. The count allowed him to go home. At that time, there was much strife and jealousy among the counts along the Yellow River. The emperor wished to put an end to their dissensions by allying them to each other by marriages. Thus, the daughter of the Count of Ludshu had married the son of the old Count of Webel. But this did not much improve matters. The old Count of Weebel had lung trouble, and when the hot season came, it always grew worse, and he would say, "Yes, if I only had Ludshu. It is cooler, and I might feel better there." So he gathered 3,000 warriors around him, gave them good pay, questioned the oracle with regard to a lucky day, and set out to take Luchu by force. The Count of Luchu heard of it. He worried day and night, but could see no way out of his difficulties. One night, when the water clock had already been set up, and the gate of the camp had been locked, he walked about the courtyard, leaning on his staff. Only his slave girl followed him. "Lord," said she, "it is now more than a month since sleep and appetite have abandoned you. You live sad and lonely, wrapped up in your grief. Unless I am greatly deceived, it is on account of Weibo." "It is a matter of life and death," answered the Count, "of which you women understand nothing." "I am no more than a slave girl," said she, "and yet I have been able to guess the cause of your grief." The Count realized that there was meaning in her words and replied, "You are in truth an extraordinary girl. It is a fact that I am quietly reflecting on some way of escape." The slave girl said, "That is easily done. You need not give it a thought, master. I will go to Webo and see how things are. This is the first watch of the night. If I go now, I can be back by the 5th watch." "Should you not succeed," said the Count, "you merely bring misfortune upon me the more quickly." "A failure is out of the question," answered the slave girl. Then she went to her room and prepared for her journey. She combed her raven hair, tied it in a knot on the top of her head, and fastened it with a golden pin. Then she put on a short garment embroidered with purple and shoes woven of dark silk. In her breast she hid a dagger with dragon lines graved on it, and upon her forehead she wrote the name of the great god. Then she bowed before the Count and disappeared. The Count poured wine for himself and waited for her, and when the morning horn was blown, the slave girl floated down before him as light as a leaf. "Did all go well?" asked the Count. "I have done no discredit to my mission," replied the girl. "Did you kill anyone?" "No, I did not have to go to such lengths. Yet I took the golden canister at the head of Weibo's couch along as a pledge." The Count asked what her experience had been, and she began to tell her story. "I set out when the drums were beating their first tattoo and reached Weibo 3 hours before midnight. When I stepped through the gate, I could see the sentries asleep in their guardrooms. They snored so that it sounded like thunder. The camp sentinels were pacing their beats, and I went in through the left entrance into the room in which the Count of Weibo slept. There lay your relative on his back behind the curtain, plunged in sweet slumber. A costly sword showed from beneath his pillow, and beside it stood an open canister of gold. In the canister were various slips. On one of them was set down his age and the day of his birth, on another the name of the great bear god. Grains of incense and pearls were scattered over it. The candles in the room burned dimly, and the incense in the censers was paling to ash. The slave girls lay huddled up, round about, asleep. I could have drawn out their hairpins and raised their robes, and they would not have awakened. Your relative's life was in my hand, but I could not bring myself to kill him. So I took the golden canister and returned. The water clock marked the 3rd hour when I had finished my journey. Now you must have a swift horse, saddle quickly, and must send a man to Weibo to take back the golden canister. Then the Lord of Weibo will come to his senses, and will give up his plans of conquest." The Count of Luchu at once ordered an officer to ride to Weibo as swiftly as possible. He rode all day long and half the night, and finally arrived. In Weibo, everyone was excited because of the loss of the golden canister. They were searching the whole camp rigorously. The messenger knocked at the gate with his riding whip and insisted on seeing the Lord of Weibo. Since he came at so unusual an hour, the Lord of Weibo guessed that he was bringing important information, and left his room to receive the messenger. The latter handed him a letter which said, "Last night a stranger from Webel came to us. He informed us that with his own hands he had taken a golden canister from beside your bed. I have not ventured to keep it, and hence am sending it back to you by messenger." When the Lord of Webo saw the golden canister, he was much frightened. He took the messenger into his own room, treated him to a splendid meal, and rewarded him generously. On the following day he sent the messenger back again, and gave him 30,000 bales of silk and a team of 4 horses along as a present for his master. He also wrote a letter to the Count of Lochu. "My life was in your hand. I thank you for having spared me, regret my evil intentions, and will improve. From this time forward, peace and friendship shall ever unite us, and I will let no thought to the contrary enter my mind. The citizen soldiery I have gathered, I will use only as a protection against robbers. I have already disarmed the men and sent them back to their work in the fields. And thenceforward the heartiest friendship existed between the two relatives, north and south of the Yellow River. One day the slave girl came and wished to take leave of her master. "In my former existence," said the slave girl, "I was a man. I was a physician and helped the sick. Once upon a time, I gave a little child a poison to drink by mistake instead of a healing draught, and the child died. This led the Lord of Death to punish me, and I came to earth again in the shape of a slave girl. Yet I remembered my former life, tried to do well in my new surroundings, and even found a rare teacher who taught me the swordsman's art. Already I have served you for 19 years. I went to Webber for you in order to repay your kindness, and I have succeeded in shaping matters so that you are living at peace with your relatives again, and thus have saved the lives of thousands of people. For a weak woman, this is a real service, sufficient to absolve me of my original fault. Now I shall retire from the world and dwell among the silent hills in order to labor for sanctity with a clean heart. Perhaps I may thus succeed in returning to my former condition of life. So I beg of you to let me depart." The Count saw that it would not be right to detain her any longer. So he prepared a great banquet, invited a number of guests to the farewell meal, and many a famous knight sat down to the board, and all honored her with toasts and poems. The Count could no longer hide his emotion, and the slave girl also bowed before him and wept. Then she secretly left the banquet hall, and no human being ever discovered whither she had gone. Note: this motive of the intelligent slave girl also occurs in the story of the 3 empires. On her forehead she wrote the name of the great god regarding this god, Tai-I, the Great One. Compare annotation to number 18. The god of the Great Bear, i.e., of the constellation. The letters which are exchanged are quite as noticeable for what is implied between the lines as for what is actually set down. The favorite wife of the Emperor Ming Huang of the Tang dynasty was the celebrated Yang Gui Fei. She so enchanted him by her beauty that he did whatever she wished him to do. But she brought her cousin to the court, a gambler and a drinker, and because of him, the people began to murmur against the emperor. Finally, a revolt broke out, and the emperor was obliged to flee. He fled with his entire court to the land of the 4 rivers. But when they reached a certain pass, his own soldiers mutinied. They shouted that Yang Gui Fei's cousin was to blame for all, and that he must die, or they would go no further. The emperor did not know what to do. At last the cousin was delivered up to the soldiers and was slain. But still they were not satisfied. As long as Yang Guifei is alive, she will do all in her power to punish us for the death of her cousin, so she must die as well." Sobbing, she fled to the emperor. He wept bitterly and endeavored to protect her, but the soldiers grew more and more violent. Finally, she was hung from a pear tree by a eunuch. The emperor longed so greatly for Yang Guifei that he ceased to eat and could no longer sleep. Then one of his eunuchs told him of a man named Yang Shiwu, who was able to call up the spirits of the departed. The emperor sent for him, and Yang Shiwu appeared. That very evening he recited his magic incantations, and his soul left its body to go in search of Yang Guifei. First, he went to the netherworld, where the shades of the departed dwell. Yet, no matter how much he looked and asked, he could find no trace of her. Then he ascended to the highest heaven, where sun, moon, and stars make their rounds, and looked for her in empty space. Yet she was not to be found there either. So he came back and told the emperor of his experience. The emperor was dissatisfied and said, "Yang Guifei's beauty was divine. How can it be possible that she had no soul?" The magician answered. "Between hill and valley and amid the silent ravines dwell the blessed. I will go back once more and search for her there." So he wandered about on the 5 holy hills, by the 4 great rivers, and through the islands of the sea. He went everywhere, and finally came to Fairyland. The fairy said, "Yang Guifei has become a blessed spirit, and dwells in the great South Palace." So the magician went there, and knocked on the door. A maiden came out and asked what he wanted, and he told her that the emperor had sent him to look for her mistress. She let him in. The way led through broad gardens filled with flowers of jade and trees of coral, giving forth the sweetest of odors. Finally they reached a high tower, and the maiden raised the curtain hanging before a door. The magician kneeled and looked up, and there he saw Yang Guifei sitting on a throne, adorned with an emerald headdress and furs of yellow swans, down. Her face glowed with a rosy color, yet her forehead was wrinkled with care. She said, "Well do I know the emperor longs for me, but for me there is no path leading back to the world of men. Before my birth I was a blessed sky fairy, and the emperor was a blessed spirit as well. Even then we loved each other dearly. When the emperor was sent down to earth by the Lord of the Heavens, I too descended to earth and found him there among men. In 12 years' time we will meet again." Once, on the evening of the 7th day, when we stood looking up at the weaving maiden and the herd boy, we swore eternal love. The emperor had a ring, which he broke in 2. One half he gave to me, the other he kept himself. "Take this half of mine, bring it to the emperor, and tell him not to forget the words we said to each other in secret that evening, and tell him not to grieve too greatly because of me." With that, she gave him the ring, with difficulty suppressing her sobs. The magician brought back the ring with him. At sight of it, the emperor's grief broke out anew. He said, "What we said to each other that evening no one else has ever learned. And now you bring me back her ring. By that sign I know that your words are true, and that my beloved has really become a blessed spirit." Then he kept the ring and rewarded the magician lavishly. Note, the Emperor Ming Huang of the Tang dynasty ruled from 713 to 756 AD. The introduction to the tale is historical. The land of the 4 rivers is Sichuan.